Hello and welcome. Welcome to the second day of this global conference on social protection, inclusive social protection for persons with disabilities, the Dialogue for Change. Thank you very much for joining this session. My name is Meredith Wyse, a social development specialist from Asian Development Bank, and I will be the moderator for this session. This session is really looking at inclusive social protection for older persons and older persons with disabilities. Just a few housekeeping points. Please note there is sign language and captioning available for this session if required. We have an excellent panel of speakers today. Each speaker will make a brief presentation and there will be some commentary afterwards to really conclude the session. If you do have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A feature and we will try and answer all the questions throughout the session. If we don't get time to come to your questions, we will follow up later by email. If there are any technical issues or you would like to share information or open comments or introduce yourselves to the other members in the group, please use the chat function. So this session, as we know, old age and disability are both core concerns of effective life cycle social protection systems, and the two issues are strongly entwined. Prevalence of disability rises significantly at more advanced ages and is indeed a core part of the rationale for old age pension systems. The majority of persons with disability are aged over 60 years old, and it's been estimated that 40% of older persons have a disability, with over 250 million older people living with moderate and severe disability. Global population aging is a key driver in the increase of numbers of persons living with disability. However, not all older persons live with a disability, and there is significant diversity in the extent of functional impairments experienced by older people with disability. Given how closely old age and disability are intertwined, social protection systems must be adaptive and responsive. And this session today will highlight examples from around the world on emerging inclusive social protection programs and seek to bring greater awareness around the key issues at stake for building social protection systems that address disability in old age. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel. From across the globe. We have Peter Lloyd Sherlock, Professor of Social Policy and International Development, joining us from the University of East Anglia in the UK. Tu Viet Na, Program Manager for Help Age International in Vietnam. Then we have my colleague, Nini Beth Karadang, Social Development Specialist from the Pacific Regional Department at Asia Development Bank, bringing in experiences from the Pacific region. We have Mr. Mohamza Prosper, Commissioner for Disability and Elderly from the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development in Uganda. And then bringing this session together, Charles Knox-Vidmanoff, a social protection consultant with a lot of experience in both old age, social protection and disability, will be joining us. But before we get to that, we're very, very pleased to be welcomed by Ms. Achayo Rose from the National Union of Women with Disability of Uganda to open this session with key asks from the organisations of persons with disabilities. Over to you, Ms. Rose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Moderator. Social protection and older persons with disabilities. Aging population are a global phenomenon with potentially substantial implications for healthcare and pension and long-term care, among others. The primary concern of effective life cycle social protection system are old age and disability, and the two challenges are interlinked. The prevalence and the level of support of disability increases dramatically as people get older. However, not all older persons live with a disability, and the level of functional limitation encountered by older persons with disabilities varies greatly. The most common old age pension scheme cover only older persons with disabilities who were formerly employed. As a result, the old persons scheme provide income support to only small segment of the population, older persons with disabilities, leaving out the majority of formerly employed in the informal sector and those who never had a chance to work. While pension schemes usually provide basic income support for older persons, including those with disabilities, they are unlikely to cover the disability-related costs, such as assistive devices, the need of care and support, increased healthcare demands, and various transport requirements. They also fail to consider the indirect costs of disability for families and wider social networks of older persons with disabilities.
Thank you, Ms. Achayo Rose, for highlighting some of the key issues that we will be exploring in today's session. So as you've highlighted, social protection systems of health, pensions, long-term care are absolutely at the core, and you've also highlighted
disabilities, leaving out the majority of formerly employed to the informal sector and those who never had a chance to work. While pension schemes usually provide basic income support for older persons, including those with disabilities, they are unlikely to cover the disability-related costs, such as assistive devices, the need for care and support, increased healthcare needs, and various transport requirements. They all fail to consider the indirect cost of disability for families and wider social networks of older persons with disabilities, who often have to stop or reduce working to support older persons with disabilities.
Ms. Achayo, we're having trouble hearing you.
Hello?
Hi, that's
better.
You
hearing?
We are, yes, thank you. Carry on, please.
So should I start afresh?
No, it's just the last few seconds.
Okay. So complementing the old age pension scheme, which with contributory and non-contributory schemes consists of cash transfer services and concessions that are capable of reaching out to older persons with disabilities, including those who were previously employed in the informal sector and those who have never worked, can go a long way towards ensuring a dignified life for older persons with disabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for really setting the scene and some of the social protection systems and some of the challenges and inadequacies at the moment. So the presentations today, we've got 4 very exciting presentations which really look at trying to address some of the gaps and the challenges highlighted by Ms. Achayo. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Peter Lloyd Sherlock to really explain about a very exciting program in Brazil. Thank you, Peter.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me clearly. I'm going to be sharing some slides for this session. So hopefully you will also be able to see my slides. You should be able to see them now. If somebody lets me know if you can't hear me clearly,
Yes.
or if you can't see my slides. Oh, super.
It's clear.
And thank you so much, Meredith, for inviting me to participate in this, I think this very important meeting. I think it's very important because often people look at old age and disability as very separate issues, and of course they are very, very strongly related for many obvious reasons. This is a presentation I developed with my colleague in Brazil, Karla Giacomin. Karla was going to co-present this with me, but she cannot because she's currently, as we speak, in a meeting with the Brazilian Ministry of Finance, which has agreed to substantially extend the intervention that we're discussing today. So clearly that was something that she could not excuse herself from. And we're going to be drawing on a number of different studies, and therefore I do have to acknowledge the funder of the main study, which is a combination of funding from federal funders in Brazil and the UK Medical Research Council, and draws on contributions across a range of different universities and organisations and individuals. So this is certainly not all my own work, nor is it all Karla's work. Just very briefly, and I don't think we need to look at this in detail, but just going back to the point I made about old age and disability being often seen as separate agendas, separate policy bunkers, separate government departments. I imagine everybody in the meeting today is very aware of the absurdity, and not just the absurdity, but the of that perspective, but the problems that it creates. Here we just have some data on the percentage of people at different ages in Brazil, so these are data for Brazil, who are defined one way or another as being severely disabled. And it comes as no surprise to see how the proportion of people who are reported as severely disabled is much higher among very old people than people at younger ages. Brazil, with reference to social protection, is seen as a country which provides a wide range of different kinds of social protection. It has non-contributory assistance pensions, the main one being the BPC scheme, which is for poor Brazilians. There are two separate streams to the BPC. One is specifically for people over the age of 65 who are poor and don't have any other kind of pension. But then there is a separate scheme for people under 65 who are identified as being disabled and, as a consequence of that, being unable to work. So again, we see this division in social protection schemes between the disabled and the old. Brazil has a universal health program, which is unified and provides universal entitlements across its population, which is a wonderful thing and has rightly been identified as a very positive model for other countries trying to develop unified healthcare. But this is the reality, particularly for older people who have disabilities and impaired mobility. This map shows for one city in Brazil, a large city in Brazil called Belo Horizonte, maps use of health centres by people aged 60 and over during a 3-month period before the COVID pandemic. And what you can see from this, this is a heat map, it shows that the frequency of making visits to health centres was incredibly influenced by how near or how far you were living from those health posts. And I think quite shockingly, the vast majority of older people over a 3-month period made absolutely no visits to a health post, let alone any other kind of health service like a hospital. So people may have entitlements on paper, but in reality, the situation is very different. And this, very briefly, is an example of why that is the case. This is an older woman I visited in 2018 in the same city. When I went to see her, she was living with her daughter, but her daughter had needed to go out for some urgent errands, for some urgent reasons. She was sitting in the position I've indicated with an arrow. You can imagine, firstly, that it would be very difficult for this older woman to go down those stairs, and there were many more stairs, to be able to access a health post if she needed to do so. But perhaps more worryingly, you can probably see where she was sitting was a very precarious and unsafe position. This was an older woman who was dehydrated, who was confused, who was dizzy, and who could not stand very easily. So clearly she was at extreme risk of falling down those stairs. So what this tells us both is that people may have an entitlement to health on paper, but in practice, both accessing health services and being in a safe place is very different. And this is quite a typical story. So with those sorts of issues in mind, although on paper you would say, great, Brazil has got pensions, it's got a unified health system, policymakers in this particular city, Belo Horizonte, 12 years ago developed a very different kind of social protection intervention for these sorts of older people with disabilities living in poor communities. And I've been involved with others in looking at it and evaluating it over the last 3 or 4 years. And I can't explain it all in great detail. I will share some links for more detailed information at the end of my talk, but it entails a number of elements. It includes a number of elements. Families who are included in this scheme get support from a trained carer, and these carers, almost all of them women, are recruited from local communities and are paid a basic wage for doing this job. They're not volunteers. These carers work a 40-hour week, and each of them cares for between about 1 and 3 families. Each family gets about 10 or 20 hours support a week, depending on their level of need and the level of need of the older person living with that family. And these care workers are not operating in isolation. They're part of a wider team of health and social services who have monthly meetings together to review existing cases to see if there are things that they need to change and to screen new applicants. We have been evaluating this scheme, and our evaluations have been extremely positive, and we're now at the stage where we're starting to share some of those results across a wide range of academic and policy outlets, publications. So the scheme was included in World Health Organization report on long-term care that was launched yesterday as the only example of good practice for older people in the Global South in that report. We've also had our program featured by the American Association of Retired People's flagship journal. We will also be flagshipping this in the United Nations World Social Report, which is coming out later in the year. And one of the reasons why we've been able to talk to all of these organizations is, excuse me, my slideshow is going backwards now, is because we have good evidence on the effects of this intervention. We have both qualitative and quantitative evidence that we consider to be robust, that the scheme works well, and that it generates a wide range of different benefits. Obviously on older people themselves, on their families who are often finding it very hard to look after them and suffer as a result, on the people who are employed as the carers who visit those families, most of whom are women with very few other employment opportunities, and also on making better use of health services. And I would just like to focus on the last of those, just as one example, because I don't have a lot of time to speak. And within that, I'm going to focus on one very specific thing, which I think is probably of particular interest to people working in disability, and that is rehabilitation. So this table, don't worry about the details, but if you just look at the bottom row, is comparing people who are included in this program that I'm describing and older people with very similar characteristics who were not. And over a period of several months, we are looking at how many visits they made to health posts for rehabilitation. And what we can show is that comparing these two very similar groups, a far higher proportion of visits were being made for rehabilitation, which I think is very important, as opposed to unplanned emergency visits for things that could have been picked up in the home had good care been already available in the home. And this is just a small example of what that means in practice. So this is one particular story, a woman telling us about her father who was discharged from hospital. And when he first came out, he was stuck in bed. We had a range of serious health problems, but gradually over time, through the support of the PMC carer, he was able to become more independent, he was able to recover, and after a period of time, it was possible to scale down the amount of support that the family was receiving from this care visitor. I could share other examples and other kinds of evidence of other beneficial effects. Most of them are included in these links, which I'm very happy to share with you if you're interested. What I would just like to emphasize very quickly at the end is that I think very few programs, schemes, interventions like this in Brazil or in really anywhere have been studied in this kind of detail, and people have really tried to assess the effects they're having. So this is a rare example of evidence-based policy, and I think it really charts the future for social protection for older people with disabilities, and also, imagine, many other people at younger ages with disabilities. Thank you. I hope you found it interesting.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for that excellent start to this session. And as you highlight the need for evidence, and that evidence making that entry point into the Ministry of Finance, which, as we know, is so important. So thank you for that. Now we're going to transfer right around the globe to Vietnam. And to Vietnam, she's a program manager with Help Age Vietnam. She's going to be exploring an exciting model in Vietnam, which really helps facilitate inclusive social protection. Now the floor is yours, 10 minutes, thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to join the conference to share with you a model that Vietnam has been implementing for more than 15 years to promote inclusive social protection for older people and people with disability in Vietnam. It's called the Intergenerational Self-Help Club Model, or ISC for short. So for the outline, I will give you an overview of the situation in Vietnam, and then details on the characteristics and the services that the club provide for older people and people with disability. So Vietnam is among the fastest aging countries in the world, even faster than Japan. And this speed will only accelerate because Vietnam also has a large population of near old people. And on the other hand, Vietnam is a lower middle income country. So in short, Vietnam has very short time to accumulate wealth to prepare for aged population, while also has very limited resources. So that's why any intervention that the country takes, the intervention must be simple, affordable, and scalable. So in terms of some statistics, older people account for 12.8% of Vietnamese population, and it is the fastest growing age group in the past 10 years. However, interventions and support to the older people age group is limited because the aging speed is very high. So the response does not catch up to this very rapid aging. Older women population outweigh older men by more than 15%. So when we develop aging adaptation policies, we need to really consider older women's need. And one every 9 older persons has a disability. In terms of how many people with disability are older people, this number is not available because of a lack of age disaggregated data in Vietnam, but roughly calculated is no less than 40%. And only recently people start to care about aging and older people with disability, that the data start to come in, but it's still very limited source of data. And also, even though older people account for a majority of people with disability, the disability policies of Vietnam do not prioritize older age group. For example, like livelihood support or capacity building training programs are out for younger people with disability, but very few, even no policies targeting older people with disability for support policies. In terms of allowance rate, it starts from $15.73 for people who are from 75 to 79 years old with living in disadvantaged areas and poor and near poor. So this group has just been added in the revised policy of Vietnam. The second group is the largest beneficiary group, which is about 1.7 million people receiving this benefit. This is the same rate, 15.73 USD. And the third group is people who are 80, who are older people who have no obligated carer. We receive from 23 to 31 US dollar. And the fourth group is people who are even more disadvantaged than the third group, and they receive higher rate of monthly allowance. And for people with disability, they receive either 31 or 39 US dollar based on the severity of their disability. Very few older people is under this group because they would rather apply for older age allowance rather than go through all the procedure to get the disability certificate to get this allowance rate. So is that enough? It's nowhere near enough because the social allowance is only 24 to 72% of poverty line in rural area and 18 to 54% of poverty line in urban area. So this is not enough. And even though recently the allowance rate for older people and people with disability was increased July last year, but at the same time, the poverty line is increased. So actually, after adjustment of policy, the percentage is even lower than before adjustment. And the allowance is has little impact to help people, older people and people with disability to live to reach the average living standard. So that's why, apart from the social allowance from the government, people really need to find other resources to make ends meet. In fact, Vietnam only spent 0.59% of its GDP for social pension for older people and people with disability, and that is low compared to other ASEAN countries, as spoken by the Ministry of Labor. So with all that, I will introduce you to the club model. This is a community-based model in village level. Why? Because the club will be accessible to people with disability if it is situated in the village level, the lowest grassroots level. This model targets to improve the well-being of disadvantaged groups, especially people, older people and people with disability. And this club provided comprehensive services for disadvantaged people, including income security. So the club provide loans and then provide labor support. The picture 3 you are seeing is an 80-year-old lady. She was blind when she turned 49, and so the club supported her with during producing of bamboo baskets for her living. And then the club, like in picture 4, also provided a sewing machine for this family of who both the parents and the child is people with disability, and also the job found the wife a job as a janitor at a local kindergarten as well, and then other services, especially sharing techniques, because older people are not eligible for livelihood training in Vietnam. And then for healthy aging, the club provide daily, encourage people to practice physical activities, and then monitoring health, and then check up and insurance, and also providing training on healthcare and self-care. Picture number 6, the club is providing training on how to care for people who are bedridden, who are paralyzed. And then social bonding, which preventing and supporting with home care volunteers. Each club will have 10 volunteers to provide ADL and IDL services, as you can see in the pictures. And then the club also promote social engagement of older people and people with disability. Picture number 5 you are seeing is Miss Mai, who is mute and deaf from birth. She was encouraged to join the group, the club, the exercise session. She became much more cheerful and then provide comfort. And then the club also provided in cash or in-kind support and labor support, and especially representing the voice of older people and people with disability. And then some clubs that they pilot the disaster risk management, like they have the volunteers they assign to people with disability to support before, during, and after the storms, for example, or support with evacuation, and then other services. And then for the lifelong learning, the club provide knowledge and skill in age-friendly way, so that older people and people with disability can easily access information and not left behind. Some clubs also piloting the pet care system, which is same as volunteer home care, but they provide more advanced medical services, rehabilitation, or giving health advices or medication. For the resource management, for the resource mobilization, this activity fuel the club operation and also provide extra support for the people with disadvantage. Right and entitlement is the activity that the club provide to support people access to their eligible benefits and rights. And this is the benefits, multiple benefits of the clubs. So how do the clubs fund all the above activities? Because the club has different income sources, and then the club decide on their own how to use the income sources. So it's very community empowerment. The club model is recognized by the Prime Minister to be a national model, as at least 3 decisions by the Prime Ministers. And also the club has strong buy-in from local government, with many provinces are allocating budget to replicate and manage the club. So the club amount in Vietnam is increasing rapidly, and it will be even more clubs in the future because of strong buy-in. And the club recently received the first prize in the Healthy Aging Prize by the government of Japan. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. In conclusion, the ISSC is inclusive, it's reaching the most advantage, it is sustainable, and it provides lasting impacts, and it is affordable for a low or middle income country like Vietnam. It's already standardized and scalable, and it's flexible to change to fit with local situation or to integrate into any other areas when needed. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Na. Thank you for highlighting the work of that. And it's also very interesting what you highlighted, often the discrimination that older persons and persons with disabilities face in accessing formal systems. Now let's move even further east to the Pacific, and Nini Beth Karadang will be sharing some experience in Tonga. Thank you, Beth, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to present to all of you Tonga's journey in developing inclusive social protection for older persons. Next slide, please. But just to give a background about the country, Tonga is a small, open economy, largely dependent on remittances, development assistance, and tourism, with contributions from agriculture and fisheries. It has a narrow production base and low connectivity, The country also faces challenges in terms of costs as a small multi-island economy and very remote from international markets. On top of that, Tonga is also ranked as second most at risk by the global climate risk, and the country is more likely to suffer serious adverse environmental, social, and economic losses as a result of climate change-induced hazards. In terms of some key social indicators, it has a population of 106,000 in 2020, and 22.5% of the population lives below the national poverty line. It is ranked as 104 in Human Development Index in 2019. Next slide, please. Tonga is an aging population. In fact, one of the very few countries in the Pacific with aging population, because majority of the Pacific countries have burgeoning youth population. With over the age of 60 years, estimated at 8.7% in 2020, and this is expected to reach 12.9% in 2050. Majority of older people live in rural areas and outer islands compared to 29% who reside in urban areas. So this highlights their constraints in accessing services. Poverty is also deemed common among older people, especially in rural areas and the remote islands. There's also a high burden of non-communicable diseases, with diabetes as the main cause of disability, and obesity rates approximately 70% of the population. In terms of existing social protection for older persons and persons with disability, Tonga has a universal health coverage free for the population. Unfortunately, the healthcare system is unprepared for an aging population. General medical practitioners, nurses, and traditional healers provide most of the healthcare services in the country. In 2012, the government embarked on its first major social protection program for the older persons, called the Universal Elderly Pension Scheme for 70 years old and above. So beneficiaries receive cash allowances depending on their age. It is estimated that 80% of the number of eligible persons were receiving these benefits. Several years after that, the government introduced the Disability Welfare Scheme. Older persons with disability are eligible to receive 50% of the disability payment if they are receiving elderly pension schemes, depending on the severity of their disability. And based on the recent available data in 2016, only 20% of disabled persons are benefiting from this social protection program. Next slide, please. So apart from allowances, there's really no comprehensive social protection services available in the country. So as you can see from the table, the average older people requiring support with the activities of daily living is around 20%. Next slide, please. This slide also shows that older people have low interaction with their relatives and friends and are also at risk of isolation. Next slide, please. So where did it all start, or how did the journey of inclusive social protection in Tonga begin? ADB piloted a publicly funded home-based care support from 2011 to 2015 in the country. The government, through the Ministry of Internal Affairs, contracted services through an NGO called Mafafine Moe Family, or MFF. And the services include support program for families of children with disabilities age 0 to 3. The NGO also provide training, supplies, and education. An important part of the caregivers' work was to help the parents dispel prevalent myths and misconceptions about how their child got a disability by educating them about their child's condition and how to care for their child. Part of the pilot is also a care and support to older persons through home care visits by trained caregivers. So each caregiver visiting 2 to 3 clients a day for about 4 hours per visit. To be eligible for the pilot program, the person had to be at least 60 years old, have a medical history, and be assessed as neglected or living in hardship or poverty. Approximately 50 children with disabilities and 200 older persons were provided with services under this pilot. How did what did we learn from this experience or from this initial project support? Pilot has been very instrumental to deal with the initial reluctance to accept home visits due to cultural values around family responsibility in Tonga, which is very strong, even in the entire Pacific region. There's a huge emphasis on community awareness and information to deal with the perception that this program would cross cultural boundaries and intrude on personal space. And it also turns out that the formal social protection pilot can be a tool for deepening community support, with some of those family members who benefited giving back through volunteer work for the NGO and communities. We also spent a lot of years in capacity building and trainings for the care workers, especially because this is a new area of work that required extensive capacity building. And due to lack of similar services and capacity, in the beginning, we found very limited competition among service providers and limited geographical coverage. Hence, again, emphasis on starting with the pilot with strong capacity building activities as part of it. The NGO government model of delivering services was successful. In fact, it is still continuing at this point after the pilot ended in 2015, and the services are now available in the outer islands. So building on, next slide, please. Building on the lessons learned, next slide, please. Building on the lessons learned and to ensure continuum of care, the government also embarked on developing Aged Care National Strategic Plan. And I just want to emphasize that this, the preparation of this plan includes multi-stakeholder planning process with the involvement of organizations with people with disabilities to be able to capture all the needs of the key stakeholders. Next slide, please. So now what we're doing is to support the country in terms of the implementation of the National Strategic Plan by assisting the government in preparing for a project that will help establish community-based aged care centers. This project will involve construction of the centers, service development with specific focus on integration and engagement of communities, promote skills and contributions of older persons such as traditional handicrafts, also prevention of abuse among older people, including GBV. Next slide, please. And this program that is currently under development right now is also supporting or preparing initiatives that will support caregivers. As you can see from the table, 90% of caregivers in Tonga are women, and already the status of women in country shows that only 38% of women and 56%, well, 56% of men are in paid employment, and economic value are not calculated for women's unpaid household and care work. The care support program will include respite care through the aged care centers. We have ongoing feasibility study of cash allowances to caregivers, as well as training program for family caregivers, linking it with formal certification as a pathway to formal employment once caregiving roles are over. It includes home modification and subsidized supplies that caregivers can buy at cost, as well as caregiving counseling services. And we're also introducing activities to support and encourage more male caregivers, like community awareness, information drive, special incentives, and promotion of recognition to male caregivers. So that ends my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you for sharing that example in a very sort of remote and low population and challenging context in which to develop inclusive social protection. Last but not least, let's travel to where we started, back to Uganda, and I'd like to invite Mr. Muhamza Prosper from the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development to explain a little bit about the expanding social protection programme. Over to you, Prosper. Thank you.
Thank you. Hope everyone is hearing me.
Yes, we are, Prosper. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be walking us through the experience of a social protection program implemented in Uganda among older persons, which later on introduced inclusion for the disability category. The government of Uganda, through the Ministry of Gender, in partnership with the UK Department of International Development, now FCDO, and Irish Aid, is implementing and expanding social protection program. This program came in place because as a country, there were several studies that demonstrated extreme exclusion of older persons, breakdown in extended family systems that used to take care of older persons, and therefore the older persons were in chronic poverty, and we needed to improve their life chances in Uganda. Therefore, the expanding social protection program was started majorly to institutionalize comprehensive social protection program, but also to pilot a senior citizens grant in 15 districts targeting 60 years olds and those who were 65 old. The program started in 2010, and the grant was later rolled out to those aged 80 years and above. So what happened was that in 2010, when we started with 15 districts, in one of the most vulnerable regions of the country in northeastern Uganda, we're targeting 60 years and above. And these are the people, as by our constitution, who are older persons, that is 60 years and above. The rest of the world, the rest of the country, we targeted 65 years and above. When the program was evaluated, it was found to be doing very well, and a decision was made to roll out the program across the country. And when we rolled out the program across the country, we decided to target 80 years and above for purposes of fitting within the resource envelope available. The program, as we talk now, is reaching close to 350,000 older persons, and studies have shown that 75% of these older persons have some form of disability. The cash transfer among the older persons started at $10 US, equivalent of Uganda shillings 22,000, and has increased now to 25,000 shillings, but due to inflation and depreciation, in terms of US dollars, it has gone down to $7. The program had started with 4 outputs. However, we didn't have an output explicit on disability. Around 2018, when we were conducting annual program assessments, it was established that 75% of the grant beneficiaries had some form of disability. Similarly, older persons with disabilities were found to be more vulnerable than the other persons without a disability. Therefore, this called for tweaks within our programming to understand and address the special needs of older persons that had disability. In light of this, a 5th output was crafted, i.e. to mainstream disability in social protection. As part of meaningful inclusion of disability and social protection, therefore, a comprehensive study was done on the situation of persons with disabilities, and this was to inform alternative options for disability inclusivity in the country's social protection programming. Among others, the 2018 study revealed the main drivers of vulnerability among persons with disabilities to include extreme poverty, additional cost of living with a disability, shocks of onset of disability, the natural factors, disability category that someone had, food insecurity, limited dietary intake, social norms and expectations that were discriminative, abuse, violence, aging with disability, among others. And the poverty drivers among persons with disabilities, we saw an extra 17% of youth with disabilities being unemployed compared to their peers who had no disabilities. We had an extra cost of about 39% among people with disabilities compared to their peers without disabilities. Therefore, this study really influenced our programming, and many changes have been initiated in our programming, including one of them being the revision of the national policy on disability in this country. The policy is now at cabinet level, trying to address the exclusions at programming level. We have also had to do a multi-sector development approach for the Regulations for Persons with Disabilities Act, so as to provide for a wider appreciation of the inclusion needs of persons with disabilities. We have had to revise a big fund called the National Social Security Fund law, so as to provide for affirmative action for persons with disabilities as part of equity principles. For instance, as part of COVID-19, the country decided to offer a midterm access from this fund, while the rest of the country were getting 20% of their savings at the age, so long as someone has saved for 10 years at the age of 45 years. For persons with disabilities, the country decided that they can actually access 50% of their savings, and they don't have to be 40 years, but they don't have to be 45 years, but they can access at 40 years. The other areas we have had to tweak include introduction of complementary services. For instance, during the paydays of older persons, we have had to include distribution of assistive devices, for instance, wheelchairs. We have had to conduct joint outreaches in a partnership with Ministry of Health, nurses, Site Savers International, with doctors and eye specialists to make sure that we do treatment for older persons with disabilities who turn up to access the entitlements. We have had to do strategic engagements in the new upcoming government programs, and these have culminated into an introduction of 10% allocation to persons with disabilities, because we think they need more affirmative action, they need more meaningful inclusion mechanism, since they can't compete at the same level with their other colleagues. We have had to revise the current disability special grant, also to target homes of older persons and centers of persons with disabilities. Similarly, we have introduced what we call productive inclusion model among rehabilitation centers, so as to enhance complementary social protection outcomes and inclusion in employment opportunities. Lastly, we have had to do a multi-sector recently during the Uganda commitments, the Global Disability Summit. We have had to do a multi-sector strategy in terms of meaningful inclusion by having different ministries that are in charge of older persons, knowing that majority of older persons also have some form of disability. Future plans: we want to benchmark to consolidate the gains of the program. We want to engage for more investments, especially also to introduce a child disability grant, because we realize most of the older persons up country are also in charge of children, the grandchildren, depend on their grandparents, and therefore the need for a child grant as a lesson. We want to broaden complementary services, include other packages. We want to mobilize partnerships. We have realized that we need to get a low-cost technology for old age in terms of access to sanitary facilities like latrines and financial inclusion. We want to roll out productive inclusion. We also want to develop a new social protection strategy based on the lessons that we have learned from this program. We also want to lower the targeting age for the SAGE program. That's the program that focuses on older persons. And want to say that since the program is targeting 80 years and above, for persons with disabilities, we want to lower the targeting age or the threshold to 60 years. We want to do a stable transition from the previous model called community-based rehabilitation model to an inclusive development model. We have realized we need shock-responsive social protection, including investments in systems for targeting during crisis situations. COVID-19 experience wasn't the best for us as a country in terms of targeting older persons and targeting persons with disabilities. We want also to introduce extra packages, including cash-in aid, vouchers, top-ups for older persons with disabilities to mitigate the effects of crisis on the value of the package in terms of the current social protection programs. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Prosper. Thank you for that excellent example of like the gradual adaptation, expansion of social protection, vulnerable social protection systems. So just thank you all so much for joining us this evening or this morning, wherever you are. I'd just like to hand over to Charles Knox-Biderman for some very sort of key last 1 minute reflections, Charles, on what you've heard today.
Yeah, no, that was an incredibly rich session. And yeah, I'm not going to attempt to kind of summarize it, but I just wanted to kind of, in a sense, bring the discussion in a way, kind of locate it within some of the broader discussions of the conference. And particularly this idea of kind of how we address different kinds of costs within a social protection system. And I just shared a brief that we developed last year that tried to look at how one applies that thinking of different costs: income security, extra cost, health, interlinkage to other services, but for older persons and disability. And yeah, so I think just to summarize that, I think something that really came out for me in this session in terms of the kind of positive is there are real examples here of attempts to build these kind of multi-layered systems, including of different kind of cash benefits that do address both income security and extra costs. I think we saw that in Tonga, we saw that in Vietnam, the way the cash benefits are kind of pieced together. So that is, I think, quite positive and moving beyond this kind of idea that, well, for older persons, we're just thinking about pensions in terms of cash benefits, and that actually it's more than that if we want to address extra costs. Also, I think this session was really fascinating in seeing the different examples of how countries with very different contexts are trying to address care and support, in some cases also via the cash benefits, but I think more strongly we heard about different efforts to strengthen care and support services. Obviously, the negative side of all of this that I think was very clearly highlighted, and the kind of limitations are in terms of coverage of many of these schemes, in terms of so many are means tested. A particular issue, it seems, coming out with older persons, that they may receive pension income, they may have some potentially be eligible for some more disability specific support, but many for different reasons are not applying or not able to access that support. Also, I think a question of adequacy, even where we see multi-layered benefits existing that in theory go over and above income security, in many cases these benefits are still very low in adequacy, and the extent to which they even address that minimum level of income security is quite questionable. However, I do think what we can kind of take from this session is, even where there are limitations, there's some quite interesting approaches and ideas in terms of how to incrementally improve systems. I think on the cash side of things, on the pension side of things, in Vietnam, Uganda, Tonga, we see this idea that, okay, we may not be able to cover everyone with the adequate level of support yet, but we may be able to do this gradually, for example, by gradually reducing ages of eligibility for schemes, gradually increasing benefit levels. And then on the core care and support side, I mean, I kind of welcome Peter's call for more of that kind of evidence based on how effective these different models are. But I think it is really encouraging to see the different ways in which different countries are seeking to develop models which incrementally expand the kind of adequacy of care and support services while kind of adapting to the national context, national realities, including kind of cultural contexts. Yeah, I think I can leave that there.
Thank you, Charles. And I see you've highlighted the document that outlines some of these challenges in the chat. So thank you so much. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you so much to the panelists for that rich tour around the globe to see what some of the exciting case studies there are. For this session, please do join the other sessions in the conference still remaining. And of course, the networking area is open as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.